Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Red Hat Collaboratory Colloquium at Boston University. We're very happy to have you here today, virtual as it may be. We have a really interesting speaker today, Sage Weil, who is project lead of Ceph. Those of you who have done any work with storage or with Red Hat or with distributed systems have probably heard of him, as well as Ceph. And also a senior distinguished engineer at Red Hat. Sage is here to speak to us about what he did during his pause from being employed at Red Hat, working on systems to help Americans vote in 2020. Sage, if you don't have the details, is a lead architect and co-creator of Ceph, which is an open distributed storage system. He helped design Ceph. It was part of his PhD research at UC Santa Cruz. And after finishing with the initial design in 2007, he continued improving Ceph and making a stable next generation distributed storage system for Linux, which we use every day in the projects that we do in the Red Hat Research Group, and lots of people use it in their commercial and academic environments too. Sage is also the co-founder of Inktank in 2012, which brought enterprise quality open storage to enterprises with open source software. And after Red Hat acquired Inktank in 2014, he worked in the CTO office, improving Ceph and helping to shape our overall storage strategy at Red Hat. And he continues to be active in lots of open source projects in addition to Ceph. So without further ado, welcome, Sage, and take it away. Oh, sorry, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A and we'll open it up to that at the end of the talk.
All right, thanks for that. Hi, everyone, let's get started. My name is Sage. I work at Red Hat in the CTO office on the Ceph storage system. And today I'm going to talk about a sabbatical I took last year to help increase voter turnout in the United States. So just a little bit of background about me. I was part of that research group that designed Ceph way back in the early 2000s. Notably, though, I co-founded Inktank in 2011 to productize Ceph for enterprise users. And in 2014 Inktank was bought by Red Hat for a couple $100 million. So last year, however, I took a break from all things Ceph and spent 9 months working on various projects to increase voter turnout and to avert what I feared could be an existential disaster for American democracy. So today's talk is about what I did last year. So as the saying goes, you should never talk about money, politics, or religion in polite company. But it turns out that I can't really talk about what I did last year without talking about at least 2 of those things. So also, I think this is pretty bad advice. I think that taboo about discussing money is partly a privilege of being rich, because it's easy not to talk about money when you have plenty of it. And it's super convenient not to avoid or not to draw attention to income and wealth disparities when you're rich. I think it's also an aspect of American culture where social status and self-worth are too closely associated with income. And I can't say I'm really a fan of either of those ideas. So I'm going to talk a bit about money today. Also, as for politics, I think avoiding the subject is primarily about conflict avoidance. But in a year like 2020, that's maybe not a luxury that we could afford. For the purposes of today's talk, though, I'm going to talk primarily about voting, which one would hope to be non-controversial in a healthy democracy. As for religion, don't worry, we're going to talk about technology and code instead. So just another note before we start. This presentation is really about me and what I did last year, how I felt about it, how it affected me and my experience. It's not meant to be about you, how you should feel, what you should do, or what you should believe. My intention is to share my experience without any implied judgment in the hopes that you'll find it interesting and maybe give you something to think or talk about. So today I'm going to talk about what I did last year, deciding to take a leave of absence from the job I've been doing for years and years, and how weird that was, how much harder it was to start something that was completely new. What I actually did, which should be the interesting part, I'm going to talk about money for a little bit, and then finally I'm going to reflect on what I take away from the whole experience. So first of all, does anybody remember what it was like way back in the fall of 2019? Because after 2020, it feels like that was a lifetime ago. But for me, at least, 2019 was a relentless onslaught of bad and disturbing news. Maybe not so different from the previous 3 years, but in any case, every day felt like there was a new horror, with norms continuing to erode for the presidency, for international relations, for emoluments, nepotism, climate inaction, corruption in light of day, all leading up to impeachment. I felt like things were objectively pretty terrible, even for establishment conservatives. And it wasn't clear to me that the country could really take another 4 years of it. But mostly, what I really got hung up on was the idea of the president getting a second term and how emboldened he would be if that happened, and what it would feel like for that to happen and to have not done enough, or maybe even anything, to try to stop it. So it was basically sort of the self-centered version of what I would imagine I would regret. But the question is, what could I do about it? Around this time, I had the idea of taking a sabbatical away from work to try to get directly involved. But the idea was kind of scary, especially the idea of doing it alone. So my first instinct was to harass one of my oldest friends, someone who'd been bugging me for years and years that we should start a new company or start a new project together. So I reached out to him and told him he should quit his new job and embark on this grand adventure to try to help save democracy or whatever it was. And interestingly, his first and immediate response was this. He said, is it better to quit your job and work on something that's totally new and admittedly important, but something you don't really know very much about or know what you're doing? Or is it better to take your highly specialized and valuable skills that you've been developing for the last 20 years of your career and use that to make a lot of money and then give that money to someone else to further that same cause? And this gave me a lot to think about for a couple of reasons. First, it made me realize that I wasn't really satisfied with just giving money away. I really wanted to be in the fight and be doing something directly. Second, I realized that my friend was in a completely different boat than I was. He hadn't been doing the same thing for 15 years, hadn't really established himself in his career yet, but he had just landed his dream job, doing exactly what he'd studied to do, and they were going to pay him obscene amounts of money to do it. Third, my job pays very well, but it wasn't the kind of fuck you money that my friend was about to earn, that it was objectively stupid to leave on the table, even if your only intention was to take that money and give it away to somebody else. And finally, I realized, or eventually realized at least, that I was already basically in the situation that he described. I'd already made an obscene amount of money from when Ink Tank was bought by Red Hat. And if I felt strongly about a cause, what was I waiting for? Well, once you decide that you're going to give away a big pile of money, at least in principle, that gets really interesting and brings up all kinds of questions. But I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. First, I'm going to talk about what I did with my time, or figuring out what that was going to be. Because it turns out that there isn't very much demand for open source storage systems developers in the political space. As far as I can tell, literally everything in the political space runs in the public cloud, in fact. And so I was sort of in the midst of this crisis of what to do when I was at KubeCon North America in 2019, and I was complaining to anyone who would listen. But it was Neil Levine, who was the product manager back at Ink Tank, who called me out and said I was basically being ridiculous, that if I wanted to help, I should just pick an organization and help them by writing code for it. It didn't matter if it was the same niche that I was accustomed to or the same language that I wanted to be using. There was always a demand for developers, especially so when you're going to work for free. Meanwhile, I asked my boss about a hypothetical leave of absence and was told basically that it was trivial. I just had to give a couple weeks of notice, get approval, and what date did I want to do it? So I was basically running out of excuses. The final thing really on my plate was that we had an upcoming Ceph release and our yearly Cephalocon conference, which was planned for early March in 2020. This was, as always, an intensely stressful part of the year, dealing with the CFPs and the sponsors and the venues and the budget and so on. But then the coronavirus news broke, cases began to spike, and we had to cancel the whole thing. So there was a sort of weird mix of disappointment and relief. But in any case, I set my end date for April 1st, and that was that. Which led me to the real problem, which was I had to figure out what I was going to do. So the first thing I did was talk to an old friend named Deborah Cleaver. We knew each other, tangential at least, from college, and had been in touch ever since. She has founded a series of different voter turnout organizations that I've been donating to. So Long Distance Voter, way back when, was doing absentee voting before anybody really knew what that was. Vote.org is probably the highest profile organization in the space today. She founded that, and our most recent organization is called Vote America. She's really well connected, and she introduced me to several people, including Jason Patordi, who is the founder of ResistBot. So ResistBot is a chatbot that makes it really easy to contact your elected representatives. A few text messages on your phone, and they'll basically take that into a letter, and they'll send it to your federal, state, and local representatives. ResistBot figures out who those people are, and then delivers your message in the most effective way, whether it's fax, email, some submission, or in the case of Congress, they have some complicated, weird system for doing it. Whatever it is, they've figured it out. They've managed to scale the simple service to insane levels. And then they also expanded into other ways to mobilize voters to exert pressure on their elected officials, like petitions that you can promote on social media. They've done a ton of other mobilization tools like election reminders, polling place lookup, notifications if you've been purged from the voter rolls, and so on. They have 9 million members now and are counting, and have sent all kinds of letters to Congress. So they're pretty cool. And it works really well. So Chris Mann is a professor at Skidmore College and is one of the foremost academic experts on voting behavior. And he did studied one ResistBot campaign last year using a randomized control trial, and showed that they achieved significant impact on turnout at a very, very low cost. So this is a perfect example of using technology to scale voter turnout very cheaply. Just a little bit about how ResistBot works on the back end. It sits on a system called RapidPro, which is a tool for building interactive chat workflows. Can talk to people using SMS or a bunch of other different platforms. It's got a pile of other custom components to submit these messages to Congress, and it's all hosted on AWS because they want to focus on functionality and not on infrastructure. So I tried to get involved here. I tried to help them change their queuing system from an ordered queue to a non-ordered queue to improve throughput, and did some stuff with DynamoDB. But in the end, I don't know, it didn't really work. I didn't really know enough about AWS and wasn't familiar enough with the tools, and it just didn't seem like a very good fit. So in the end, I ended up doing sort of my secret backup plan all along, because I knew that if I couldn't find something better, I could always just go work for Deborah at Vote America, her new latest voter organization. And it turns out that this was the best decision I made in 2020. So first, I'm going to geek out a little bit about voting in America. So there are about 230 million voting eligible Americans today. But in 2016, only 139 million of them voted, which is just 60% of the voting eligible population. That means that more than 95 million Americans didn't vote. And significantly, people of color are 40% of the population, but are only 27% of the electorate in 2016, which is objectively disturbing. It turns out that there might be some low-hanging fruit in all this, in this 95 million people number. A study in 2016 found that 37% of Americans don't know what day election day is. About a third couldn't correctly define what the Electoral College was, and also a third were unaware that membership in the Republican or Democratic Party wasn't a requirement to run for president. So Deborah was pretty horrified by this, because her mission and the mission of all her different organizations is to ensure that the electorate matches the population. So if 40% of the population are people of color, then 40% of the electorate should be too. So she wondered, what would happen if you aggressively marketed voting to people of color? Could you radically increase voter turnout? Which was mostly a theoretical question until Alabama's special election in 2017. Now, Alabama is an interesting state because 29% of the registered voters there are Black, but the way that the parties behaved, you wouldn't really know it. It seemed pretty clear that both parties were going to completely ignore Black voters in that election. So she decided to market the hell out of voting to Black communities and fully saturate all media channels. So they took out 150 billboards in majority Black counties. They got a few digital billboards with fancy countdowns. They put ads on the side of city buses in Birmingham. They did the same thing for bus shelters. And then they purchased cell phone numbers for 300,000 registered Black voters, about 30% of all voters in the state, Black voters in the state. And they hired humans to send peer-to-peer text messages to them, proactively providing basic polling post data. And they specifically said that they expected record high turnout, because if you say it enough times, people believe it, and the fear of missing out with voting is a real thing. And then just to top it off, they sent 200,000 pieces of direct mail to all these voters. So what happened as a result of this? First, a Democrat won a Senate seat in Alabama, which is objectively surprising. But what's more interesting is why that happened. Because everyone predicted that there would be high white turnout and low Black turnout. But for once, the electorate matched the population. So Black voters are 29% of the population. And in this election, they are 28% of the electorate. So at its heart, Vote America is a voter turnout organization whose goal is to get 100% participation in American elections. Now, it turns out that increasing voter turnout tends to hurt modern day Republicans. And Vote America's view as a 501c3 organization is that that's the GOP's problem to deal with, and says more about their relationship with democracy and their voters than anything else. So to increase turnout, Vote America views the voting population a little bit different than campaigns and most other organizations. So most campaigns identify likely voters, especially those that are aligned with their candidate or issue, and relentlessly targets them. This leads to this self-perpetuating cycle where low propensity voters are ignored, vote at lower rates, and then are continued to be classified as low propensity. However, if your aim is to get 100% participation in all elections, the population to focus on is those people who don't usually vote. So instead of calling them the low propensity voters, Vote America likes to call them high potential voters. So our general strategy then is to take nonpartisan programs, like reminding people when election day is, and scale them very cheaply with technology. First, this works because technology, it turns out, is very cheap. And second, it turns out it's also true that all the research, which is done in collaboration with academics like Chris Mann, who I mentioned earlier, has shown that nonpartisan messaging is much more effective at getting people to the polls. As soon as people detect some sort of political bias in messaging, they tend to stop listening. The second thing that Vote America does is target what's called the Rising American Electorate, or RAE, a term I believe that was coined by the Voter Participation Center, one of the largest direct mail voter registration groups in the country. Anyway, the RAE is basically three broad demographic groups. It's young people under 30, people of color, and unmarried women. These are growing demographic groups that vote at much lower rates than the overall population, but collectively represent a majority of the American electorate. So to get to 100% participation or anything close to it, Vote America targets high potential rising American electorate voters. So one of the first projects I worked on was at Vote America was looking at where you could get the best return for investing in turnout. So it turns out that if you turn out voters in a heavily red or heavily blue state, it doesn't really have any impact on who's elected president, thanks to the Electoral College. The more competitive the state, the more important it is that you turn out those people to vote. But also, if there are other elections that are on the same ballot, like a Senate race or a governor's race, then the overall impact of that vote is greater. The more competitive races you have on the ballot, the better the return on turning out that particular voter. So I built this huge spreadsheet that pulled in race competitiveness data from a bunch of different sources, mostly the Cook Political Report, and built a system for scoring which congressional districts would have the most competitive races on the ballot, including Senate, state, congressional, governor, and president. And complete with a scoring system so you can figure out what the importance was of each. I even pulled a bunch of census data and historical turnout data to try to identify which congressional districts would have the most high potential voters. Unsurprisingly, in retrospect, you'll see that a bunch of Georgia districts here are right on top of the list. That was a very important state in 2020. I also repeated this process at finer granularity to include state legislative districts, so for state upper and lower houses, which in most states are completely unrelated to all the federal congressional districts. These maps are totally bonkers. This incorporated both whether the individual seat was deemed competitive, data for that was really hard to find, by the way, but also whether the overall chamber was competitive, whether you might be able to flip power in the chamber. I did this because the overall balance of power in the state houses was especially important in 2020 because of the census year. And these newly elected state legislatures are going to be the ones who are responsible for redrawing district boundaries for the next 10 years. And whether we have fair, non-gerrymandered districts that are actually competitive will depend on which party holds power in the state houses and governor seats, and whether they support either nonpartisan independent commissions for drawing districts or whether they aggressively gerrymander the districts to help them win elections. I'm going to let you guess which of the two major parties, where the two major parties currently stand on those issues. In any case, the question we wanted to answer was, if Vote America has limited money to invest in GOTV programs, where is that money best spent? The first place we use this is in the campus program. So way back in 2018, at vote.org, they found that they could increase college young voter turnout by up to 2% just by putting ads in college newspapers. In 2019, they continued testing with billboards, flyers, coasters, and digital ads, and they found that with multiple media channels, they could affect turnout by up to 6%, which turns out to be a pretty good return on investment. So in 2020, they scaled this idea, raising millions of dollars for a program that included campus paper ads, digital ads, billboards, and posters, and also digital influencers on TikTok and other social media to talk about the importance of voting and making your voice heard and all that stuff. All told, Vote America reached some 3 million students in 29 states at schools chosen based on the competitiveness scoring that I had helped create, which is pretty exciting. The core of the efforts, though, at Vote America were around their website, which is driven on the back end by an open source or mostly open source project called Turnout. So Turnout is a Python Django project backed by Postgres, Celery, and Redis, and hosted on AWS. It seems like everything I did in 2020 actually was hosted on AWS or on Slack. The front end is based on Gatsby and Netlify and some other stuff, but I ended up using that, so I don't know too much about it. In any case, Vote America makes voting easier by building the very best tools to help you register and vote, and then reaching out to high potential voters, for example, by sending them text messages and encouraging them to use those tools to do so. So those tools are mostly what I helped improve over the summer. Because elections are managed at a state and local level in this country, every single state has a different set of tools, rules, and processes for voting. Vote America's tools aim to make this as simple as possible. So for example, the Verify tool lets you check whether you're currently registered to vote, regardless of what state you're in. The Register tool helps you register to vote online. This varies by state. In most cases, we can just send you off to the state's online voter registration tool. But in other cases, we help you prepare a PDF that then you can print and mail yourself. I'll talk a little bit more about that one later. And the Absentee tool helps you request a ballot to vote by mail, which became increasingly important in 2020. Let's talk a bit more about that one. So in 11 states, there's no online ballot request system, but voters can submit their ballot requests electronically by email or fax. But to do that, they need to either own a printer and have a scanner or know how to electronically scan their signature and put it on a PDF. So Vote America built an e-sign system that allows voters to complete this process completely on their smartphone. So the voter goes to the website, fills out the form for their state absentee form or whatever it is. And this example is for Massachusetts, so it's a pretty simple form, but the absentee forms are different for every single state, and so we'll ask for all the right questions depending on what state you're in. And then the voter just takes a picture of their signature with their smartphone on any random piece of paper, like the back of an envelope, and then they upload it or text it to us from their smartphone. We take that signature and clean it up for the voter, and then we use that to sign the form for them. And then we take that completed form and we email it, or in the case of Kansas and New Hampshire, where email isn't allowed, but fax is, we fax it into the voter's local election office. No kidding, in several states, democracy runs on fax machines. So Fuzzy, the engineer who built the system, had to get his aunt to dig her old fax machine out of a closet so he could test this whole system. The legal principle that allows us to do this is electronic signatures. So the signature law dates back to the 90s when federal law established that fax signatures are just as valid as written signatures. This is distinct from a digital signature like a finger on a touchscreen, because a digital signature has never had a physical manifestation, whereas an electronic signature is a pen on paper signature just transmitted via electronic means. And it's legally valid everywhere in the country. In any case, Fuzzy built an algorithm that takes these crappy cell phone photos and cleans them up so they can be emailed and faxed, allowing you to request an absentee ballot completely online on your smartphone in those 11 states where you couldn't do so before. So my involvement in the absentee tool was with one particular piece that simplified the workflow. So unsurprisingly, you need to figure out which election office you're going to send that form to. With registration, voter registration, it's not a problem because there's a federal law that established a standard form that you can always send to one state address. So it's pretty simple, but absentee ballot requests are state by state and vary widely. So in the initial workflow on the application, there's a big drop-down box to select which local election office that apply to. In most states, this is your county, and so it's not too hard to find it on the list, but it is somewhat annoying. But in other states, not so much. So New York has boroughs that map to counties. It took me a while to figure this out. In a bunch of states, there are certain cities that have their own election offices that are distinct from the county. So if you're outside the city limits, but inside the county, then it goes to one place. But if you're inside the city limits, it goes somewhere else. Alaska has like 4 geographic regions that mostly map to state legislative districts, but not entirely. Luckily, the geocoding API service that we're using to look up addresses and normalize them could give us the state leg districts, and so we could use that. But then we had to encode all these exceptions for what city you're in to map you into the right district. Alabama has 1 county, Jefferson County, that's split into 2 parts, the Bessemer and Birmingham districts. Here I actually had to email somebody who worked for the city to send me a GIS data file with the specific line, and then I could take the longitude and latitude and figure out what side you were on, which side of the line you're on in order to figure out what office to send it to. And then Massachusetts, Wisconsin, and Michigan were just an utter mess. Where I live in Wisconsin, for example, my mailing address says Madison, but I'm actually inside the village of Shorwood Hills. And so I ended up for Wisconsin and Massachusetts having to get these big data, GIS data files from the state and using the geocoded longitude and latitude, figuring out where you are. We enabled the post-GIS extensions on our Postgres database, and this actually worked out pretty well in the back end. But it was a real project, and there were a whole bunch of test cases to deal with to make sure it worked. In the end, I had something that was about more than 99% accurate, which might seem a little bit problematic. You don't ever want to get this wrong because you don't want to disenfranchise the voter by screwing up their form. But it turns out that in reality, it's not quite that bad, because if you send your form to the wrong election office, they're just going to put it in a pile and then pass it on to their coworker in the next town over or whatever. It'll just add a couple days to the processing. On the other hand, every additional step we have in these online workflows, you lose users because they get distracted or lose interest or whatever it is. And our goal at Vote America was to maximize the number of people who ultimately go through what we call the voter journey, where they go from an unregistered voter to registered to vote, and then actually eventually vote. So the first thing that complicates helping people move along this journey is moving. Every time you move, you have to re-register to vote. In 41 states, you can register to vote online, but online voter registration, even when it is available, requires an in-state driver's license or ID card. So re-registering to vote online only works if you're moving inside the same state, or you've already gotten your new ID for your new home state, which if you're anything like me, that can take a while. Also, lots of states don't have online voter registration at all. So I'm going to take a really quick digression here and talk about Texas, which is an illustrative example of the forces at play here. So Texas does not have online voter registration, even though online voter registration reduces costs and increases turnout. While it costs more than $1 to process the paper form, it's less than 3 cents to process the online application. And so not having online voter registration is literally a waste of time and money. Texas is one of only 9 states that don't have online voter registration. I'm going to let you guess which political party is in control of those state houses. In any case, in 2018, Deborah built an online voter registration specifically for Texas using a similar system to the e-sign thing I just described for absentee ballots. So Texas law says that you can fax in your voter registration form as long as you also print and mail a copy within 4 days. So they built this system, would print out all the print forms in a big pile, and then they'd mail a big thing to all the election offices every day via FedEx. And they actually flew to Texas to personally talk to all the county clerks and let them know they were going to do this and then turn the system on. But then the Texas Secretary of State totally lost his mind. He went on the record saying that, well, the law says copy, he always interpreted that to mean the original copy. And he demanded that they turn the system off, even though he didn't actually have the authority to demand that. And the lawyers came out and chaos ensued. So for 2020, we wanted a different solution. In order to deal with states like Texas, we needed a way to help people register to vote or request an absentee ballot, even if they didn't own a printer, which printer ownership in the US is in the low single digits. So nobody has a printer these days. So the solution is pretty straightforward. We built a tool where the voter completes the registration form on our website. We print out the form and mail it to the voter. They sign the form, and then they use the enclosed pre-addressed, pre-stamped envelope that will then send that form back onto their local election office. The good news is we found a vendor that would allow us to submit mail via an API. We generate a PDF and make an API request with all the relevant address information. And about a week later, a physical letter would show up in somebody's mailbox, which was pretty fun. The bad news is that this particular vendor wasn't used to handling return mail that went to a third party, in this case, the appropriate local election office. So we couldn't use all the prepaid metered mail or whatever. They had to have people physically apply stamps to a bunch of envelope inventory, which led to a two-week lead time before we could actually start sending these things, which caused a lot of nail biting because we kicked this project off right at the beginning of August. But by the end of the month, the code was complete, I had samples in hand, and we turned the system on. Anyone using our register tool on the website could request a paper form be mailed to them, and then they could sign and forward that form onto their local election office. All told, we mailed over 20,000 registration forms in 2020 and more than 16,000 absentee ballot request forms using the system. But coming back to the problem of movers, we tried to tackle mover re-registration by reaching out to just about everyone who moved in the United States last year. Through what must have been some very slick talking, Vote America had negotiated a partnership that gave us a sort of a near real-time feed of all the movers in the US based on change of address requests. And we used this to build an entire program around movers. So we would initially just email them information about how important it was to re-register to vote and give them links to tools to do so. But then once we had this print system for interstate movers, or movers within states like Texas, we went a step further and we just would preemptively mail them a blank voter registration form along with a stamped envelope and remind them to re-register to vote, which you can do by mail even if you don't yet have your in-state driver's license. So coming back to the voter journey, the other big piece of this was that in 2020, we were in the midst of a pandemic and we leaned heavily into voting by mail to try to keep both people and democracy alive. The biggest part of this program was texting people, so helping them register to vote either in person or by mail. So dealing with SMS and tracking individual voters' status along this journey ended up being another big part of what I worked on last year. So the first part was handling our SMS subscriber list. So Vote America has what's called a short code, a shortened number that can send and receive text messages. So whenever a voter made use of any of our online tools to register to vote, check the registration, whatever, we asked for their phone number and then added them to this SMS list. So there are a ton of rules about what you can do with the short code, mostly negotiated with the carriers to ensure that you don't piss people off and make a bunch of people complain. But it mostly boils down to users having to opt into the list and having very clear instructions and respect for when they opt out. So anyway, my first project involved learning how to use the Twilio API, which is basically an API for dealing with all things related to telephones, SMS, MMS, voice, even fax. And then I wrote some code to handle sending welcome messages as soon as somebody used their tool, telling them that they're on our list, processing the stop messages if they wanted to opt out, and responding to help and other random incoming messages and so on. This bot scope quickly expanded to include drip messages to help nudge voters along their journey. So we'd send messages if they didn't finish the online workflow or if they didn't download the PDF to print or whatever it was. This was entirely separate from Vote America's other and much larger peer-to-peer SMS program. So while I was working on the SMS list for voters who had used our tools and opted into our program, there was an entirely separate peer-to-peer team that was building what was one of the largest texting programs in the country in 2020. So peer-to-peer texting is different in that it comes from long codes, thousands of them. So these are like normal looking phone numbers. The messages are sent to phone numbers for people that we pull out of the voter file. So more than 30 million people were targeted in our case. And because these are unsolicited messages, every message is legally required to be initiated by a human who is either clicking a mouse or pushing a key on a keyboard. All told, Vote America's team of paid and volunteer texters sent over 100 million peer-to-peer texts in 2020. I'm sure many of you got several of them. You might be asking where we get these phone numbers and what is a voter file? That's a question that I think deserves a little bit of attention because I didn't know, and it was something that initially kind of blew my mind. So in its simplest form, a voter file is just a database of every registered voter in the country, including their full name, address, phone number, and date of birth. So their voter registration record by the state. That is, the simplest national voter file is just an aggregate of data pulled from every state's voter rolls. Voter rolls are a matter of public record, but each state has varying rules around who is allowed to access the file, what they're allowed to do with it, and how much it costs. The rules vary a bit, but the common elements seem to be that if you're a political campaign, you can do whatever you want. If you're other organizations, you have certain rules, like not trying to sell people stuff, and that it usually costs money to get the file from the state. But with 50 states, it's a pain in the butt to deal with them directly, which is why everyone just gets a copy of a national voter file. These also include a ton of other information, like consumer information, credit, marketing information that's gathered by these big data firms, all for a single low price, and you have like half a dozen different vendors to choose from. So the voter file that we used had some 260 million records in it, which was super creepy. And there were 681 different columns in the database. So it starts with basic information like names and addresses. Then it includes a bunch of voter registration information that are pulled from these state voter rolls, including party affiliation and so on. Your voting history, what elections you voted in. On top of that, you have information about people's race that's either known from your voter rolls or has been modeled by who knows what kind of organizations you've been known to donate to, what your household income and mortgage history and estimates of your net worth, how likely you are to take a vacation, what kind of car you drive, on and on and on. Anyway, we use a very small subset of this to identify members of the RAE, the Rising American Electorate. So young people, people of color, and unmarried women. and also which of those people are going to be low propensity or high potential voters, as we like to call them. The other key data we relied on was what was called the absentee strike list. This is basically a curated table of active voter registrations and the status of their absentee vote by mail ballots, whether they'd requested the ballot, whether the ballot had been mailed to them, whether it had been returned, and ultimately, after the election, whether it had been counted or rejected. So in September and October, this information was pulled from the states at sort of increasing rates from daily to weekly, depending, so that organizations like ours could effectively target their get out the vote programs. So I worked with Michael Snook, our main data person, to help build and maintain the automated SQL pipelines to help refresh this data, update the target universe of people that we're going to be texting, map voters to phone numbers, track each voter's status along the voter journey. This included also processing responses from the text, either the peer-to-peer side or the blast side, and to make sure that we're sending them only relevant messages based on whether they actually requested the ballot, do we bug them about returning it, all that stuff. One other piece that I built on the texting side was an MMS message that we sent out to all of our users, more than 1 million of them, the weekend before election. That included a nice map of their registered address and their assigned polling place. We used multiple data providers to get accurate polling place information, the same APIs that powered the tool on our website, and Mapbox's API to generate these pretty maps. Twilio, it turns out, has a strict limits on how quickly you're allowed to send MMS messages. So I had to carefully string these out over 2 days to reach voters during daylight hours, and we wouldn't wake them up. But the coolest part was that you could take any of these messages from our shortcode, including this MMS, and you could reply with the word helpline, and you could get connected to a human volunteer to answer any question you might have about where to vote or how to vote or whatever it was. So the voter helpline was a late addition to Vote America's program, one that came entirely from an outside volunteer named Tomer, who built the helpline in his spare time over the last couple of years. The idea was simple. Voting is hard and people often need to ask for help. Texting is easy. Why not connect voters with volunteers who can answer them? So the helpline was basically this unholy combination of Twilio and Slack APIs. It turns out that Slack has all these interactivity features and an extensive API for building chatbots. So Tomer created this JavaScript node application that glued the two together in a way that allowed us to present voters with a nice slick, or not voters, volunteers with a nice slick Slack-driven chat interface. And then they connected voters with Slack channels by state, so that volunteers could focus on a single channel, a single state, and one set of laws and rules that they could become experts in and answer questions. There are also some interactive bits to help volunteers update the voter journey status and so on. For me, this is one of the most challenging projects to work on because it forced me into a completely new tool set. This was my first time using JavaScript or TypeScript. And also using Visual Studio Code. And first time in more than 20 years, I'd used Visual Studio, which was a nice reminder that modern development tools are actually pretty amazing and the world is much bigger than VI and Macs. But all told, the helpline was a big success. We helped more than 12,000 voters. We had some 350 volunteers. And also it was one of the most satisfying ways to kill some time and volunteer by talking to real voters with real questions, and in most cases, actually be able to help them in a meaningful way. So it's very satisfying. Before moving on, just to say a few more things about the overall experience of working at Vote America. It was incredible to work with a talented and diverse group of people. The tech team was pretty small, it was only 4 or 5 people, but overall the organization had more like 20 with data scientists, researchers, political comms people, program planners, legal. It was an amazing group of people with veterans from half a dozen presidential campaigns, and it seemed like there was always somebody who knew somebody that we wanted to get in contact to. For me, it was very interesting joining the team as a junior member and non-expert. I realized it'd been a long time since I'd been in that position. And it was a refreshing experience to be really nervous giving status updates during stand-ups. The other amazing part was that we had a shared common purpose that kept us motivated and focused. So one of those random bits of advice that sticks with me came from a book called Drive, or at least came to me via a talk that my wife saw about that book. But the basic idea is that for job satisfaction and fulfillment, you need 3 things. You need purpose, you need something that you're working toward, presumably important. You need autonomy, the space to make decisions in your work, and you need mastery. You need to be good at what you're doing. And if you can find these 3 things, then you're one of the lucky ones. My stint at Vote America had purpose easily covered because if nothing else, 2020 was extremely motivating. By virtue of being on a small team, I worked with a fair bit of autonomy on a range of different projects, but also it was a good reminder that I could master something that was totally new. I realized that I'd become increasingly reticent to dive into new projects that were unfamiliar. Telling myself it wasn't the best use of my time or whatever. And this year was sort of a good opportunity to check myself and remind myself that I could in fact learn new tricks. Anyway, that brings me back to almost last thing. I promised I would talk about the money too. So you remember in that early conversation with my friend, I realized I had gobs of money at my disposal, but I hadn't really given a significant amount of it away, at least not relative to the total. This whole topic has a whole host of fraught questions. You know, what's the reasonable amount for a person, a rich person in particular, to spend on causes that are important to them? How much is enough? And enough for what? Is it to assuage your guilt or to make a real difference? And perhaps more importantly, what's the point of having more money than you need or more money than you'll ever spend? In Vote America's fundraising calls, Deborah likes to say that you should give until it hurts, but not as much as the last 4 years. I like that sentiment, but it wasn't particularly prescriptive. I don't pretend to have any answers here, except to say what made sense for me. The first thing I realized that for me, there was sort of a natural ceiling to the cost of my lifestyle. Beyond a nice house and yard and car and whatever else, I'm not particularly interested or comfortable with anything that's too extravagant, especially with the inherent dangers of raising kids with excessive privilege. In the case of the ink tank sale, I realized that my lifestyle hadn't really changed that much, just the number in my bank account. Second, I'm not a big believer in dynastic wealth. Beyond providing for college, I don't think my kids are entitled to big trust funds or anything like that. Because let's be honest, as a rich white family, they're going to have plenty of advantages as it is. And finally, I'm not interested in playing investor. It's stressful, it's hard, and I'm not very good at it. And so what I realized is that once I sort of accept that the savings, the big number in the bank account is mostly disposable without having any noticeable impact on your lifestyle. And once you get past all the social and structural pressures that tell you that you have to hoard it, from financial managers to tax people strategizing about inheritance taxes to on and on, what they're paid to do, the questions get more interesting. It's like, how do you spend it? What do you actually care about? What would make the world a better place for your kids or for future generations, for the planet? What would have the most impact on people's lives? Do you spend it all in 2020 since it feels like a once in a lifetime crisis? Or do you save it in case there's something else that's going to come along later that's even worse and even more important? Clearly, you kind of need to go somewhere in between. In the end, I settled on something that was pretty arbitrary, which is partly why I like Deborah's pitch. In 2020, we ended up giving at a rate that would leave us broke. Broke in this case, meaning we were forced to make our way by virtue of our well-paying jobs, like everyone else, within about 4 years. So this seemed to work out reasonably well last year, although clearly it's not sustainable. I don't know, maybe that's not particularly helpful information for other people, but there are a couple interesting things that I did learn along the way on this journey. The first was in early 2020, one of the first people I met was Tamer Mokhtar, a donor advisor strategist who I knew from our mutual support at vote.org. He helped me identify organizations that needed early funding and helped drive home this really important principle that early money is much more valuable and impactful than late money. It's much better to give someone $1 million a year before an election than $1 million a month before an election. Partly that's just basic business and the time value of money. Partly it's that if there's a flood of money at the end, all you can do with it is buy ads in an already saturated market. But there are some more subtle effects too, and a couple of fun acronyms that I learned along the way. The first is Emily, which means that early money is like yeast. It makes the dough rise, which cracks me up. But the underlying idea here is that if you invest in a campaign or organization early, it makes it easier for them to raise money from other people later by virtue of the implicit validation that you've provided. The second is a bit more practical. Malcolm means money arriving late creates organizational and logistical mayhem, which must be so true and just makes me laugh. Anyway, some of the cool organizations that Tamer helped me find were VoteER, which aims to mobilize patients seeking healthcare. This one's really interesting because their original concept was to put kiosks in emergency department waiting rooms so that people who rely on the ER for healthcare could register to vote while they're waiting. They had to make a hard pivot with COVID and switch to these lanyards and placards with QR codes that patients would scan and get sent to tools like those Vote America provided to help register to vote or get their absentee ballot and so on. There are some other good organizations we identified. Resist Bot I already mentioned. It turns out their AWS and Twilio bills are really big. Rural Democracy Initiative focuses on research and resources for progressive candidates in rural America, a demographic that is arguably what tipped the presidential race in 2020. Their research shows that support for quote unquote progressive policies is actually quite high in rural America, things like universal health care, a $15 minimum wage, pre-K education, and so on. But when they're asked a simple question of which party is looking out for people like me, they overwhelmingly say Republican. So I'll let you make of that what you will. The Sister District project focuses exclusively on state legislatures, which are important because of redistricting, of course, but also because most laws and policy is local. They basically pair volunteers in non-competitive districts with competitive districts to help those candidates and races. And the last one I'll mention is the National Popular Vote, which is a plan to make states allocate their electoral votes to the winner of the National Popular Vote. So this was a ballot on the ballot measure in Colorado for the first time, and it passed. I won't get into the merits of the popular vote, except to point out two maybe non-obvious side effects. 96% of all presidential campaign events and spending happens only in 12 battleground states. And I'd like to submit, what would presidential campaigns look like if people actually cared how the rest of the country voted? And second, and unsurprisingly, voter turnout is higher in those battleground states where their vote actually makes a difference. So if you have higher turnout in presidential elections in all states, could that mean better representation in local government as well? So I'll finish up with a couple of parting thoughts. First, I want to mention the For the People Act, which if you think that voting should be easy and accessible to all eligible Americans, this is something you should look at. Most notably, it requires that all states provide online voter registration and same-day registration, so you can deal with states like Texas. It also requires states to allow no excuse absentee and vote by mail, something that most states did in 2020, but not all of them. And it also requires the availability of early voting, which means you can vote or register in person anytime 2 weeks before an election. Separately from voting, it requires the use of nonpartisan redistricting process, which could potentially end gerrymandering. It also requires donors and super PACs and other dark money organizations to disclose the identity of their donors. Notably, all of these things in and of themselves enjoy majority support from voters in both major political parties. It's crazy to me that this is going to be a nasty political partisan battle, but it definitely is. Beyond that, I don't have anything really except some pithy advice that I find to be helpful. I think that if we want to be part of any movement for social or political change, it will invariably put us in situations where we're uncomfortable, and we need to be willing and to get used to doing so. I also think that often the thing that is preventing us from doing what we want to be doing is just our own rationalization for why we haven't done it yet. At some point, we just have to get out our own way. And finally, I think it's not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth it. I love this quote, by the way, partly because this guy, Art Williams, is actually some billionaire insurance salesman, and probably the last person I would expect to be quoting, but I love the quote. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any and all questions in the time we have left, or even stay after if I don't have a hard stop. Or naturally, if you have any questions about voting, feel free to text helpline to 48298. Thanks.
Thank you, Sage. That was really interesting. And we do have several questions here. There's a great range of them. So we'll start with a detail one. There was a question about the national voter file and whether that is generated by a government agency or created by data companies, or what and where does the info that they put into it come from?
So the states maintain their own database of registered voters, and then the national data firms, there are like a half dozen of them, they basically pull that data from all the states, they aggregate it into one database, they do all this cleanup, and then they layer in all the other research that they have. So they have all this financial credit information that they get from, I don't know where they get the other information, but they're the ones who basically layer in all this other information. There's no government-based national voter file. It's all state-driven. And
do they get paid for putting that into the files, or like it's not open source creating that file?
No. So to get access to those national voter files, it's like tens of thousands of dollars. I don't remember the exact price. In Vote America's case, we were part of this like collective that was a bunch of different organizations that sort of pooled resources to get access to a bunch of voter files, and also they had like data teams and data scientists that they would share among different organizations to do. If you had some weird query that you need to run, you could go ask somebody. And so we didn't pay the full price that you would normally pay, but it's less than 100 grand. It's, I think,
okay.
I don't know, somewhere in there. It's expensive,
Still
but
expensive.
it's not that expensive to get a database.
Not out of the question. Got it.
Super creepy.
We have a couple of questions from Ziba Parisa Cranmer relative to students especially. The first one is, how long does a civic tech platform like this stay relevant? Because you have to keep changing the data, and she's heard that everything has to be overhauled every election. Is that true?
Yeah, maybe not every election, but it is a constant headache. So we had, the other thing Vote America did that I didn't mention is that they have this database of basically that tries to make sense of the 50 different states' voter rules. And so they'll have this API that you can query to find out the deadlines for registrations and for whatever. There's a whole set of people that did nothing but keep that up to date. And so there's a lot of maintenance there. The data pipelines were like very fragile. We were constantly changing them and fixing them, and they'll be totally different for the next election. But I think the core tools are mostly the same, like the voter registration forms and so on. They rely on having that up-to-date data about all the deadlines and dates and which states you have to send emails versus faxes to, and what the current link is for the online voter tool and so on. So it's a lot of upkeep.
Wow.
And
yeah.
I mean, I think the interesting thing is that a lot of what Vote America built, like these tools to allow you to request your online ballot, your ballot online. If this For the People bill passes, then that'll be required of all states. And like a lot of what we did will no longer be necessary, which is nice. That's sort of that.
So you want to become
really
obsolete
make
in a way.
ourselves obsolete. Yeah.
Right. Cool. And Ziba's other question was, what do you recommend for students who want to get engaged in these kind of projects? Because she knows there are a lot of students at BU and other places who are interested in it, and practicum courses where they could do it.
Yes. So there was this really great organization that we worked with. I'm blanking on the name, but it was basically this pool of volunteers, and they would basically triage the volunteers and like allocating them to projects and organizations that just needed some sort of technical help. And we worked with a whole set of different people on different like specific problems, like cleaning up data sets and whatever through this group. They were awesome. I think that would probably be where I would point to, but I can't remember what the name of the group is yet. If I can follow up later and share it in the chat. I also don't know how active they're going to be post 2020, like in an election year. I think they had a huge spike. Mm-hmm. I don't know exactly what the sustaining thing is or not. But.
So it kind of sounds like volunteers get channeled into, are you a volunteer who would do a support line, or are you a volunteer who would do programming?
For non-technical volunteers, Vote America you could volunteer to do the texting stuff, or you could do the helpline. The helpline was so much fun. I would highly recommend that in the next election. That was really nice.
But you could also volunteer as a student to do technical stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Very cool. Another question, sort of related. What advice would you give someone who is earlier in their career and thinking about taking a leave of absence to work on these kind of issues or other issues, or even changing careers if they're coming from a computer science programming kind of background? I guess for mostly thinking about the idea.
I mean, I think everybody's situation is different. Like, I think it really depends on like, what's the cost and can you afford it? But my general advice would be go for it. Like YOLO, I don't know. If you think it's important, then, and there's a need, then the rest can wait. But it's easy for me to say that because I'm in an easy situation. But, yeah.
So Nathan Weinberg wants to know, are you going to continue working with Vote America or with the other organizations now that you're back as a full-time working person at Red Hat?
I would like to. I found that it's hard to split my time. There is like one project that I started right at the end that's basically just a monitoring system for making sure these state websites actually are up or down. So if they're down for too long, you can sue them and tell them to extend their voting hours or whatever. and just like it turns out that it's hard to like split my brain into two parts. I'm trying to stay involved. I think the hardest part is actually on the other side, on the fundraising side, because all these organizations that I supported last year are like doing their next thing, and it's like they're doing really, really good work, and it's hard not to just like keep giving them money when you're going to run out. So yeah.
Yep. Yeah, there's different ways to keep working.
Model there.
Another question relating to how people can get involved or what you think is happening. Do you think there are projects or organizations that are working on the voter suppression bills that have been in the news and discussed a lot lately?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge threat to democracy, and I think everybody in the space is mobilizing. In fact, I think Vote America is actually one of the main plaintiffs in a lawsuit in, I think it was Georgia, the Georgia law. And I think their point was interesting because everybody got all up in arms, and the press was all about like, you can't give money to people in line, which is like super annoying, but not actually. I think that's like the red herring. The actual problem is that it disallows preparation of forms for other people. And so our e-sign system, or even just our register thing, that basically you type in the stuff in a form and we just fill the form for you and let you print it out or deliver it, would no longer be legal. You like they're just like adding all these barriers to like prevent you from helping people do something that should be automatic. So yeah.
Look,
anyway, that's what they're saying about it.
Okay. There's a note from Hugh Brock here saying that he got one of your Vote America forms when he moved to Maine. Not really a question, but
that was me. I did that. You're welcome. Hopefully it looked okay.
And I guess one more question because we're almost done. Aran Krieger says, do you think there are organizations that would want to mentor students for these kind of projects? We have cloud computing classes and things like that where students can work on these things. And we usually, are not thinking about projects that are outside the scope of technical problems that are, the kind we run across all the time in data centers. And also, do you think services like AWS or other hosting services would be interested in getting involved?
That's a good question. I mean, maybe I think part of the challenge is that most of these technical teams are very small, and so they're doing a lot. And so adding this sort of mentorship part of it, I think it really depends on the quality of the person. I mean, that's true of all mentorship maybe, but I don't know. I can ask. I think Vote America had one of the more technically capable teams that we encountered. We ended up sort of inheriting all these other projects, like the voter helpline. There was some other random person who built like something that scraped the ballot tracking data from the Texas state website. And we built a quick website around that. That got a bunch of traffic. We worked a lot with that organization. I talked about that sort of triage as volunteers.
I'm sure Aran will follow up as well. Okay, there were a couple other questions we couldn't get to, but hopefully they show up in the Q&A, and you had mentioned you could stay a little bit late if people want to stay a little bit late to look at those. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I think this was really interesting. We learned a lot, and I appreciate your time to come up with this new talk and share it with all of us here at BU and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.